Number 11. The voice that had to sound rested. Before the key turned in the lock, Carol practiced her greeting out loud, once, to an empty kitchen. It came out flat the first time. She tried again. Lighter. Marriage guidance of the era did not just ask a wife to look pleasant. It asked her to sound pleasant, warm, unhurried, as if she'd been waiting all day with nothing but good news to share. A short or weary tone at the door could read as coldness, even resentment, even when the only thing behind it was 8 straight hours on her feet. So women learned to perform a register of voice that had nothing to do with how they actually felt. The greeting was rehearsed the way a line is rehearsed before a stage entrance, except no one called it a performance, and no one paid her for the show. The hollow sound of her own voice bouncing off empty cabinets was the first sign that something here didn't add up. If her face could be fixed with a compact, her voice took longer to get right, and it had to be right before he ever crossed the threshold. Sounding rested was manageable. Looking rested through an entire dinner, under a bright kitchen light, for an hour with no break, was a harder trick to hold on to. Number 10. The kitchen time to the minute. The roast is checked against the clock on the wall, not against Carol's hunger, and not against how tired her legs feel after standing at that stove since 4 in the afternoon. Home economics guidance of the period built entire kitchen routines around one single goal: dinner ready and hot, at the exact minute a husband's workday ended. Whole systems of timing, whole diagrams of efficient movement between icebox and stove and table existed to hit that minute precisely, year after year, in kitchen after kitchen. It sounds like a small domestic detail. It was actually a full workday, engineered around somebody else's clock, with no clock of her own anywhere in the design. If the roast came out late or cold, that reflected on her, not on the schedule itself, which was never up for negotiation. The low tick of the stove timer in Carol's kitchen was the same tick counting down in 1,000 other kitchens on her street, all timed to the same invisible whistle. Her own exhaustion had no clock at all. There was no 5:40 for her fatigue, no schedule that said now she gets to rest. Dinner was on time. She was not, and no one had built a system to notice. Number 9. The apron she took off before he saw it. At the sound of the car in the driveway, Carol's fingers go straight to the apron strings behind her back. It comes off fast, the scorch mark and the flour dust folded inward before it's hung on its hook by the pantry door. Household advice of the era treated visible mess, visible effort, visible tiredness as things a wife managed quietly, out of sight, before anyone else arrived to witness them. The kitchen could look like a small battlefield at 5 o'clock, and by 5:40 it had to look like nothing had happened there at all, as if dinner had simply appeared. That transformation was labor too, layered on top of the labor that made the mess in the first place, invisible on top of invisible. A stained apron worn in front of a husband could read as a wife who was letting things slide, who wasn't quite keeping up. So the apron disappeared, and with it went the only physical proof that any real work had been done that day. The dry rustle of the strings pulling loose was a small, private sound nobody else in the house ever heard. Her body could hide the mess. It could not hide everything. There was one thing left that no amount of quick folding could put away in time, and it showed up at the dinner table whether she wanted it to or not. Number 8. The yawn she wasn't allowed to have. At the table, over the roast that came out exactly on time, Carol feels it rising and covers her mouth with the back of her hand. A yawn. Nothing dramatic. Just a body running on empty after a full day of standing, bending, lifting, and timing everything to somebody else's schedule. But marriage columns of the period treated a visibly tired wife as a wife who wasn't managing herself properly for her husband's benefit, as if fatigue itself were bad manners rather than a plain fact of the body. A yawn at dinner could be read as boredom, as complaint, as anything except what it actually was, which was exhaustion, ordinary and unremarkable in anyone else's life but hers. She learns to blink it back, to swallow it, to turn it into a small smile instead, quickly, before he notices. That ache behind her eyes doesn't go away. It just goes underground, folded in with everything else she isn't allowed to show. This is the moment the rules stop being only about how she looks. They start being about what she's permitted to feel in front of another person, and what she has to erase before it ever reaches her face. Hiding a mess in a kitchen was manageable. Hiding a need for rest from a system built to read every gesture was something else entirely. Until now, the rules lived in her own reflection. The next ones lived in someone else's file. Number 7. The column that diagnosed her marriage. On the counter sits a folded copy of Ladies' Home Journal, open to a page Carol has read twice already this week. The column is called Can This Marriage Be Saved?, launched in 1953, written under the name of Paul Popenoe, using case files drawn from his American Institute of Family Relations in Los Angeles, an operation the magazine itself called the largest and best-known marriage counseling center in the country. The cases inside sound close enough to her own evenings that it's uncomfortable to read them twice. A tired wife. A husband who feels neglected, unappreciated, ready to look elsewhere for peace. And the column's answer is almost always the same, no matter what the husband has actually done. Look first at what you might be doing wrong. The ink smudges faintly under Carol's thumb as she turns the page again, the paper thin and soft from handling. This was not a magazine simply observing marriages from a comfortable distance. It was training millions of wives, in kitchens exactly like hers, to examine themselves first, before anyone examined the schedule, the workload, or the husband sitting across the table. The rule had moved. It was no longer a private habit of fixing her face in a mirror before he walked in. It was now printed, syndicated, and repeated in a national magazine every single month, in millions of homes at once. And if the column suggested a wife look inward, the next step in this system was a man whose entire job was to do the looking for her, in person, across a desk. Number 6. The counselor with no training in her. Carol pictures it clearly enough, though she has never gone herself and hopes she never has to. A waiting room chair, a case file with someone else's marriage inside it. A counselor on the other side of a desk, calm, certain, taking notes in neat handwriting. Popenoe's Institute is documented advising women whose husbands drank, or strayed, or raged, to ask themselves what they had done to cause it, so that harmony, as the counselors themselves called it, could be restored between the two of them, quietly, without much fuss. Popenoe's own credential, for the record, was in horticulture, not psychology, not medicine, not any formal study of the human mind at all, a degree in growing plants, applied instead to the inner life of American marriages and treated by a national magazine as genuine expertise worth trusting with a family's future. That hush of an office designed to feel clinical, authoritative, and calm was doing real work on the women who sat in those chairs week after week, waiting their turn. It made an untrained man's opinion feel like a diagnosis handed down from science itself, backed by a building with a name and a receptionist and a waiting room full of other wives just like her. It made a wife's own exhaustion, her own quiet unhappiness, into evidence against her rather than information about her day, her hours, her workload, her feet still aching under the desk. She was the patient. She was rarely the expert on her own tiredness, no matter how well she understood it from the inside. If a counselor couldn't fix the tiredness underneath all of this, there was already something else waiting in a pharmacy a few blocks away that promised to. Number 5. The little pill beside the coffee cup. Carol has heard the name already, the way you hear a brand before you ever buy it, from a neighbor over a fence, from a magazine advertisement, from a hushed word at a church supper. Meprobamate, sold as Milltown, approved the following year, in 1955, and within 12 months, one of the most widely prescribed medications in the entire country, appearing in a striking share of all American prescriptions written that year alone in nearly every town with a pharmacy counter. It was marketed toward the nervous, the fatigued, the wife who couldn't quite explain why she felt the way she did, years before Valium would take over that same market entirely and become its own household name in kitchens across the country. The small, dry click of a tablet against a water glass became, for many households, a quieter and more private sound than any counselor's office could ever offer. Easier to keep secret, easier to repeat. A pill could be swallowed alone, in a bathroom, before anyone else in the house even noticed it was gone from the cabinet. It did something for the feeling. It did nothing at all for the schedule that produced the feeling in the first place. The roast, the clock, the apron, the rehearsed voice, still waiting there every single evening. That was the part that never got said out loud, by anyone, in any advertisement, on any label. A chemical answer to a workload problem meant nobody ever had to change the workload itself. The tiredness could be quieted instead of acknowledged, muted instead of questioned by the one person who could actually change it. And the moment doctors began treating it this widely, they also needed a name for it, official enough to write on a chart and hand to the next doctor down the hall. Number 4. The name doctors gave her exhaustion. Carol has heard the phrase applied to a woman 2 houses down, spoken almost sympathetically, The way you'd mention someone's bad hip or a stubborn cough that never quite clears up. Housewife syndrome. A real, documented medical label used by physicians of the period for a familiar list of complaints: fatigue, irritability, insomnia, a general sense of being worn thin by the middle of the week, every week, without much variation. Medical writing of the era often treated these symptoms as personality or nerves, or something closer to hormones than to hours spent standing, bending, lifting, and timing dinner to somebody else's clock, day after day, with no relief in sight. The cold vinyl of a waiting room chair, the clipboard resting on a doctor's knee, the brief examination that rarely lasted more than a few minutes before a prescription pad came out, all pointed toward the same quiet conclusion, reached the same way in office after office. Something was wrong with her, not with her day. Calling it a syndrome gave the exhaustion a clinical shape, which made it sound like an illness to be managed rather than a workload to be questioned by anyone in a position to actually change it: a husband, an employer, a household routine built entirely around someone else's convenience. A diagnosis like that stayed mostly private, spoken quietly between a woman and her doctor behind a closed door, filed away, rarely discussed again. But there was one place this same tiredness could stop being private entirely and start being read out loud, in front of a room full of strangers, on the record, for anyone to hear. Number 3. The word used against her in court. Carol has never stood in a courthouse hallway, but she can picture the sound of it easily enough, from a magazine story, from a neighbor's hushed account of somebody's cousin. Heels on tile, a folded petition passed between hands, a clerk's low voice reading names off a list, one after another, all morning long. Divorce proceedings of the period often treated a wife's coldness, her complaints, her failure to make a husband comfortable, as a form of marital fault, something a lawyer could name plainly and a judge could weigh against her in open court, in front of strangers, on a record that would follow her name afterward. The same exhaustion that earned a diagnosis in a doctor's office, the same tiredness that had a pill waiting for it at the pharmacy counter, could be read in a courtroom as evidence that she was the one who had let the marriage fail, quietly, over years of small complaints nobody had taken seriously at the time. Nobody asked how many hours she'd spent on her feet that week, or that year, or every year before it. Nobody entered the roast, the timed clock, the rehearsed voice, the folded apron, into any official record anywhere in that building. Only the outcome mattered in the end. A wife who seemed unwilling, unpleasant, or worn down enough to complain out loud in front of people who mattered. The echo of heels on that hallway floor carried the full weight of every kitchen, every waiting room, every folded magazine page that came before it, all funneled into one hallway, one judge, one afternoon. If a feeling this ordinary, this common, this shared by nearly every wife on the street, could cost a woman standing in a legal proceeding meant to weigh fault, it was worth asking exactly what all of this had actually been protecting. It was not her. Number 2. The career that was never supposed to show fatigue. Back in her kitchen, still holding the roast pan, Carol thinks through everything the last several hours actually required of her, laid end to end like a ledger nobody ever asked to see. Marriage experts quoted in the pages of Ladies' Home Journal described being a wife as a career in itself, one requiring the skills of a diplomat, a businesswoman, a cook, a nurse, sometimes even a school teacher, all folded into a single unpaid role with no title, no office, and no one to report the hours to. It was called a career, with real admiration, in print, in a magazine millions of women read every month at kitchen tables just like hers. But a career anywhere else in American life comes with hours, with breaks, with the plain acknowledgement that the person doing the work gets tired sometimes and needs to rest. This one didn't come with any of that. No shift ended. No supervisor clocked her out. The weight of the pan in her hands feels heavier than it should by now, and that has nothing to do with the roast still inside it. Calling her job a career, while refusing to let her show a single sign of the fatigue any real career produces, was not an oversight anyone stumbled into by accident. It was the design itself, built the same way in kitchen after kitchen, street after street. An unpaid, unbounded role that had to look effortless from the outside, no matter what it actually cost her on the inside, every single evening, for years without end. Everything on this list, the lipstick, the voice, the apron, the column, the counselor, the pill, the diagnosis, the courtroom, comes down to the same hidden rule, and it is waiting one number away. Number 1. The tiredness with no acceptable name. The car turns into the driveway. Carol closes the compact one last time. The same object from the very beginning of this evening, except it doesn't look like the same object anymore. A decade later, Betty Friedan would write about this exact exhaustion and call it the problem that has no name. But in 1954, in Carol's kitchen, that same feeling already had no honest name of its own. It had substitutes instead, a whole list of them, each one aimed somewhere other than the truth. Nerves, syndrome, personality, marital fault. A wife could be told she needed a pill, told she needed a counselor, told she needed to examine her own behavior more closely, told her coldness was the reason a marriage was failing, and not one of those explanations ever reached for the word that actually applied: tired. That was all it ever was, underneath every rule on this list. A body that had done real, physical, unpaid work since early that morning, and had nothing left to give by the time headlights swept across the kitchen window. But a tired wife was never simply treated as a tired person. She was treated as a marriage problem to be counseled, a medical case to be diagnosed, a legal liability to be weighed in a courtroom, anything and everything except a human being who had worked too many hours without rest. Every rule on this list, the lipstick, the rehearsed voice, the folded apron, the syndicated column, the untrained counselor, the small pill, the clinical label, the courthouse hallway, existed to protect one single idea: that the system asking so much of her could never itself be questioned. So the exhaustion it produced had to be questioned instead, examined, medicated, or blamed. The work was real. The tiredness was real. The paycheck, in this case, didn't even exist to prove it. The only thing 1,954 would not allow, in any column, any office, any courtroom, was calling it exactly what it was. The front door opens. Carol closes the compact and sets it back beside the sugar canister, the same spot it started in, though nothing about it feels quite the same anymore. If a lipstick tube, a kitchen clock, or a folded magazine page ever meant more in your family than anyone said out loud, tell us what you remember below. Subscribe and come with us to the next hidden rule. Carol is 27, standing in her kitchen in 1954, 20 minutes before her husband's car turns into the driveway. A roast sits in the oven. A compact mirror leans against the sugar canister. She opens a lipstick tube, checks her reflection, and smooths an apron with a small scorch mark. She isn't preparing a meal, she's erasing a day. Number 12, the face before the car in the driveway. Carol snaps the compact shut, then opens it again. The lipstick goes on a second time, though the first coat was fine. Magazine advice of the period was blunt about this hour of the evening. A wife was told to freshen her hair and her face before her husband walked through the door. So the first thing he saw was composure, not the day she'd actually had. It sounds like vanity. It was not. It was maintenance, timed to a schedule that belonged to someone else's workday. No one had to write this down on a card and hand it to her. It lived in every column she'd ever read, every neighbor's window she'd passed at the same hour, doing the same thing. The rule was not in a handbook. It was in the room, in the hallway mirror, in the 10 seconds before the door opened. A tired face read as a wife who wasn't managing things. A fresh one read as a marriage running smoothly. The lipstick was not about beauty. It was a mask for exhaustion she wasn't supposed to show. And once her face passed inspection, the next thing that had to sound right was her voice.